History is usually decided by kings, generals, and elite soldiers. We are taught that battles are won through superior strategy, advanced weaponry, and the disciplined formations of professional armies. We imagine the clash of steel, the roar of cannons, and the thunder of cavalry charges. But sometimes, history takes a turn so bizarre, so utterly unpredictable, that it defies every rule of warfare. Sometimes, the fate of empires does not rest in the hands of knights in shining armor or feared shock troops. Sometimes, it rests in the hands of the people making the soup. Imagine a battlefield in Hungary in the late 16th century. On one side stands the might of Christian Europe, a coalition of 50,000 heavily armed soldiers confident, disciplined, and on the verge of a total victory. On the other side is the Ottoman army, broken, demoralized, and fleeing in panic. The Sultan himself is trembling in his tent, ready to abandon the field. The elite janissaries have been routed. The line has collapsed. The enemy is already inside the camp, tearing through tents and celebrating their triumph. The battle is, for all intents and purposes, over. And then, something happens that has no parallel in the annals of military history. A swarm of scullery maids, woodcutters, grooms, camel drivers, and cooks, armed with nothing but kitchen knives, axes, logs, and copper ladles, decides that they are not going to accept defeat. What followed was not a battle, but a bewildering explosion of chaos that turned a guaranteed victory for the Habsburg coalition into one of the most humiliating catastrophes ever suffered by a European army. This is the story of the Battle of Keresztes, a conflict that proved that desperation is the most dangerous weapon of all. To understand how a group of kitchen staff ended up fighting the flower of European chivalry, we must first look at the world of 1596. This was the era of the Long War, a 13-year grind between the Habsburg monarchy and the Ottoman Empire. For decades, these two superpowers had been locked in a stalemate along a militarized frontier in Hungary and Croatia. It was a brutal, exhausting conflict of sieges and raids, a war of attrition where fortress towns changed hands like currency. The Ottoman Empire, once the unstoppable juggernaut that had shattered the Hungarians at Mohacs and besieged Vienna, was showing signs of fatigue. The Sultan, Mehmed III, was a new ruler. Unlike his warrior ancestors who lived in the saddle, Mehmed had spent his life in the gilded cage of the Topkapi Palace. He was soft, inexperienced, and deeply insecure. However, the pressure to prove himself was immense. His viziers and generals urged him to lead a campaign personally, something an Ottoman sultan had not done in 30 years. Reluctantly, Mehmed agreed. He gathered a massive host and marched north, aiming to restore Ottoman prestige and strike a decisive blow against the Christian infidels. His target was Eger, a strategic fortress in northern Hungary. The campaign started well enough. Eger fell after a short siege, a victory that bolstered the Sultan's confidence. But the celebration was short-lived. Intelligence reports began to arrive, speaking of a massive relief force marching to meet them. This was not just a local garrison. It was a grand coalition. The Habsburg Archduke Maximilian III and Prince Sigismund Bathory of Transylvania had combined their forces. They brought with them German heavy cavalry, Hungarian hussars, and arguably the finest infantry in Europe at the time. The two armies converged on the plain of Keresztes. The terrain was treacherous, a patchwork of marshes and muddy fields that would prove to be a nightmare for maneuvering large bodies of troops. As the forces deployed, the sheer scale of the confrontation became clear. The Ottomans, despite their numbers, were at a technological disadvantage. The European forces possessed superior firepower, particularly in their heavy muskets and field artillery. The Habsburg cuirassiers, encased in plate armor and wielding wheel-lock pistols, were a terrifying force that the lighter Ottoman cavalry struggled to counter. The battle did not happen in a single afternoon. It was a multi-day affair, a grinding series of skirmishes and maneuvers that slowly bled the confidence out of the Ottoman ranks. On the first day of fighting, the Ottomans attempted to cross the small river that separated the two armies. They were met with a wall of lead. The Christian fire was disciplined and devastating. The Ottoman vanguard was repulsed with heavy losses. By the second day, the mood in the Ottoman camp had shifted from caution to concern. The Sultan, terrified by the sounds of battle and the sight of his wounded soldiers, held a council of war. He asked his commanders if he should retreat. It was a shameful question for a sultan to ask. His tutors and generals had to stiffen his spine, reminding him that the shadow of God upon earth could not flee before the battle was decided. They convinced him to stay, but the seed of panic had been planted. Then came the third day, October 26, 1596. This was the day the Christian commanders decided to deliver the knockout blow. They launched a massive, coordinated assault across the marshes. The Ottoman lines, already shaken, began to buckle. The European infantry, utilizing the Spanish tercio formation, a mix of pikemen and musketeers, ground forward like a machine. The Ottoman artillery was overrun. The elite Sipahi cavalry tried to countercharge but were cut to pieces by the heavier German horsemen. By early afternoon, the situation for the Turks was catastrophic. The right wing of the Ottoman army had completely disintegrated. The left wing was fighting for its life. The center, where the Sultan's imperial tent was pitched, was exposed. Mehmed III, watching the disaster unfold, was reportedly in a state of absolute terror. He was seated on his throne, wearing the mantle of the Prophet Muhammad and holding the holy standard, tears streaming down his face, asking his spiritual advisor if he could leave yet. The Christian forces pushed forward with the momentum of an avalanche. They broke through the final defensive lines of the Janissaries. The road to the Sultan was open. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that the discipline of the Christian army began to evaporate. And this is where the story pivots from a standard military history into something resembling a dark comedy. In the 16th century, an army camp was a city on the move. The Ottoman camp at Keresztes was enormous, filled with tents, supplies, treasury chests, and thousands of non-combatants. There were the cooks who fed the soldiers, the grooms who tended the horses, the woodcutters who cleared the paths, the camel drivers who managed the logistics, and the slaves who did the heavy lifting. When the Christian soldiers broke through the lines, they saw the Sultan's tent, but they also saw something else. Loot. Gold, silk, jewels, expensive weaponry, and exotic supplies were lying there for the taking. The discipline that had allowed the Christians to smash the Ottoman army vanished in an instant. The soldiers stopped fighting and started pillaging. They broke ranks. Officers lost control of their men. The heavy cavalry dismounted to rummage through chests. The infantry dropped their pikes to grab bolts of cloth. They were drunk on victory and greed. They believed the enemy was gone, fleeing into the marshes to die. They pushed deep into the heart of the Ottoman camp, right up to the kitchens and the supply trains. The Ottoman soldiers had indeed fled, leaving the camp followers behind to their fate. These cooks, slaves, and laborers knew exactly what happened when an enemy army sacked a camp. They would be slaughtered without mercy. There was no escape. They were surrounded, unarmed in the military sense, and facing thousands of bloodthirsty soldiers. Cornered animals fight with a ferocity that predators often underestimate. But these were not just animals. These were men who realized they had nothing left to lose. Somewhere in the chaos of the supply train, a spark ignited. It wasn't a strategic order from a general. It was a primal scream of survival. A group of woodcutters and cooks, seeing the Christian soldiers distracted by looting, grabbed whatever was at hand. They didn't have swords or muskets. They had axes used for chopping firewood. They had heavy copper soup ladles. They had carving knives, spits, and logs. They had the tools of their trade, which in the hands of desperate men became weapons of war. They charged. Imagine the scene from the perspective of a Habsburg soldier. You have just won the battle. You are stuffing a sack full of silver coins. You are laughing with your comrades. Suddenly, a man in a greasy apron screams at you and smashes a heavy iron pot into your face. Before you can draw your sword, another man hits you with a log. It was absurd. It was terrifying. The camp followers didn't fight with the calculated rhythm of soldiers. They fought with the frantic energy of a riot. They swarmed the isolated looters. They hamstrung the horses with kitchen knives. They bludgeoned the armor. Knights with axes. And as they fought, they started to shout. They yelled that the Sultan was still there. They yelled that the Christian army was fleeing. In the confusion of the smoke and the looting, nobody knew what was actually happening. The Christian soldiers in the rear heard the screaming and saw their comrades in the front falling back, not from an enemy army, but from a swarm of angry civilians. But they didn't know they were civilians. In the dust and chaos, it looked like a fresh Ottoman reserve force had arrived. Panic is a contagion. It spreads faster than fire. The Christian soldiers who were deep in the camp laden with loot tried to retreat to defend themselves. But as they turned back, they ran into the waves of their own men still pushing forward to get their share of the plunder. The formation collapsed into a crush. Then the camp followers did something even more psychologically devastating. They began to chant and cheer as if the Sultan himself had ridden out to lead them. The Ottoman chroniclers later wrote that the cooks and grooms shouted, "The infidel is fleeing," with such conviction that it became a self-fulfilling prophecy. At this critical moment, the actual Ottoman soldiers, the sipahis and janissaries who had been routed and were fleeing the field, heard the noise. They looked back. They didn't see their camp burning. They saw the Christian advance stalling. They saw the enemy running backward. They didn't understand why, but they realized the battle wasn't over. Shame is a powerful motivator. The professional soldiers had been outfought by their own servants. Seeing the cooks holding the line, the cavalry stopped their retreat. The janissaries rallied. They turned their horses and marched back toward the sound of the guns. Now the trap snapped shut. The Christian army was in total disarray, jammed into the narrow corridors of the tent city, their formations broken by their own greed. They were facing a mob of enraged servants in front of them, and now the returning professional Ottoman army was hitting them from the flanks. The psychological reversal was instantaneous. The 50,000 Christian soldiers, who an hour ago were masters of the field, broke. The retreat turned into a rout of horrific proportions. The terrain that had made the battle difficult now made the escape impossible. The marshes of Keresztes, churned into deep mud by 3 days of fighting, became a graveyard. The heavy armor that protected the German knights became their coffin. Horses bogged down in the mire. Men slipped and were trampled by their comrades. The Ottoman cavalry, fueled by vengeance and the miraculous turn of events, hunted them down without mercy. The camp followers, the heroes of the hour, joined the pursuit, using their ladles and axes to pull knights from their saddles. It is estimated that 20,000 Christian soldiers died in the slaughter that followed. The coalition that was supposed to drive the Turks out of Europe was annihilated. Archduke Maximilian and Prince Sigismund barely escaped with their lives, fleeing the field in disgrace. The victory was so unexpected that even the Ottomans couldn't believe it. When the sun set, the Sultan was still sitting in his tent, dazed, unsure if he was a prisoner or a victor. When the dust settled, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. The Ottoman chroniclers, who usually focused on the bravery of the Sultan or the skill of the generals, were forced to admit the truth. The battle had been won by the Kaha, the camp rabble. It was a humiliation for the professional soldier class, but it was a miracle for the empire. This event became known in Ottoman history as the Battle of the Spoons, or the Battle of the Ladles. It is me, that sounds whimsical, almost like a fairy tale, but it reflects the brutal reality of what occurred. The symbol of the victory was not the sword or the crescent standard, but the wooden spoon of the common cook. The aftermath of Keresztes was profound. For the Habsburgs, it was a trauma that lasted for a generation. They had assembled one of the finest armies in Christendom, led by high nobility, equipped with the best technology, and they had been beaten by a mob of servants. It shattered the myth of European military superiority that had been building during the war. It prolonged the long war for another decade, as neither side could muster the strength for a decisive campaign after such a bloodbath. For Sultan Mehmed III, the battle was a propaganda triumph. He returned to Istanbul not as the hesitant, frightened man he was, but as the conqueror of Eger and the victor of Keresztes. Parades were held in his honor. Poets wrote verses extolling his bravery, conveniently leaving out the part where he wept and tried to flee, and glossing over the fact that his kitchen staff had done the heavy lifting. Interestingly, Mehmed never led an army again. Perhaps he knew he had used up all his luck in one afternoon. He spent the rest of his reign in the palace, dying a few years later. But if we look deeper, the Battle of Keresztes offers a fascinating insight into the nature of warfare and human psychology. It strips away the romanticism of military history. We like to think of battles as chess matches, where the better player wins. Keresztes shows us that a battle is a chaotic, fluid, emotional event. It shows us that discipline is fragile, and that greed can undo the work of thousands of men. The Christian defeat was not caused by a lack of skill or courage, it was caused by a lack of restraint. The moment they prioritized, looting over securing the victory, I ceased to be an army and became a mob. A mob is easy to break, even for a group of cooks. On the other side, the Ottoman camp followers demonstrate the power of desperate improvisation. They acted as a hive mind. There was no general commanding the cooks to flank the enemy. There was no strategy meeting among the woodcutters. It was a collective, instinctual reaction to an existential threat. They proved that in the mud and the blood, a copper ladle swung with the intent to kill is just as deadly as a forged sword. The legacy of the battle also speaks to the rigid social structures of the time. The Janissaries and Sipahis, the elite warrior castes, were deeply embarrassed by the victory. They had failed in their duty, only to be rescued by the people they considered beneath them. In the years following the battle, there was actually tension and resentment. The heroes of the battle were not elevated to nobility. They went back to their kitchens and their stables. The empire was happy to accept the victory, but it wasn't keen on upending the social order to acknowledge who was responsible. The story of the Battle of Keresztes remains a strange anomaly in the history of the Ottoman Habsburg Wars. It is a reminder that history is not linear. It does not always favor the strong or the technological. It is filled with accidents, blunders, and moments of sheer madness. When we look back at the grand tapestry of European history, we see the names of great commanders: Napoleon, Wellington, Suleiman, Charlemagne. We study their tactics and their genius. But perhaps we should spare a thought for the anonymous camel driver who picked up a rock, or the unknown cook who grabbed his soup ladle, and in doing so, changed the course of history. They remind us that while soldiers fight for flags, and kings fight for glory, the common man fights for survival. And there is no CE on earth more terrifying than a person who realizes that the only way to live is to charge into the teeth of death. As the sun set over the marshes of Hungary on that October evening, the silence that fell over the battlefield was heavy with the dead. The looting had stopped. The screams had faded. The Habsburg coalition was broken, their dreams of liberating Hungary dashed in the mud. And amidst the wreckage of the greatest army in Europe, the Ottoman campfires were lit once again. The cooks, exhausted, bloodied, and alive, went back to work. After all, the Sultan had to eat. The war was not over, but for one night, the most unlikely army in history had held the line, armed with nothing but their courage and their kitchenware. This is the enduring lesson of Keresztes. It serves as a warning to the overconfident and a testament to the desperate. It teaches us that the line between victory and defeat is razor thin, and sometimes it is drawn not with a sword, but with a spoon. The narrative of the invincible conqueror is fragile. The narrative of the helpless victim is equally fragile. On the plain of Keresztes, the roles were reversed, the scripts were burned, and the world was turned upside down. In the end, the history books may record the movements of the heavy cavalry and the decisions of the archdukes, but the ghost of Keresztes whispers a different truth. It whispers of the chaos, the mud, and the moment when the lowliest servants of an empire stood tall against the iron tide of Europe and shouted,